This is Granny Charlotte's Adventure Stories, and today we're reading Chapter 7 of Little Pilgrim's Progress. But as always, we have some vocabulary words. These are kind of difficult, so listen close. Our first word is formalist, and of course this is a person that Little Pilgrim will meet on his journey. A formalist is a person who doesn't think they ever break rules or ever break laws. They do everything just the way they're supposed to do it. That's formalist. Our second word is hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is another person that Pilgrim will meet on his journey. And hypocrisy, or a hypocrite, is a person who pretends to be good or to do good when they don't really mean it. Have you ever said, "I'm sorry" to your mom or to your sister because somebody made you do it and you didn't mean it at all? Well, that's hypocrisy. And our last word for today is timorous. It's not a word you come across very often, but this is again somebody that Little Pilgrim runs into. And timorous comes from the word timid, and it means full of doubt, full of fear, or afraid. Sometimes we would even use the word shy. So that's timorous. Well, let's get to our reading. When little Christian had gone some distance from the place where the three boys lay sleeping, he turned and looked back, thinking that perhaps they might now be fully awake and more anxious to be freed from their bands of iron on their feet. But he could not see anything of them, and he was just moving on again when he heard a noise on his left hand and saw two boys climbing up on the wall. They both dropped over into the way of the king, and seeing little Christian, they ran up to him. "Where have you come from?" he asked. The boys, whose names were Formalist and Hypocrisy, answered, "We've been living in the land of vainglory, but we are now going to the celestial city to see the king." "But don't you know," said little Christian, "that you should have come in at the wicket gate?" "Oh," cried the boys, "that is much too far from our country. We just made a shortcut across the fields and came over the wall." Little Christian thought that the king would not like people to begin their pilgrimage in this way, and he said, "I am afraid you should not have done so." "Oh, don't you bother about it," said they. "Our people never go round by the gate. Besides, what does it matter as long as we get onto the right road? You came in by the gate and we came over the wall, and now we are all exactly in the same place." "I don't think you ought to have done it," said little Christian. "What nonsense," they replied. "We are just as good pilgrims as you are, except that you have such fine clothes, which very likely somebody had to give you because your own were not fit to be seen." This was a very rude and unkind speech, and little Christian felt inclined to answer back in the same way. But he had read in his book that the king's servants ought to always speak gently, even when angry words were spoken to them. So he waited a minute and then said quietly, "That is quite true. My things were all spoiled and shabby, and the king gave me these clothes himself. It was very kind of him, and I am very glad he did it, because now I am sure that when I get to the city, he will know that I am one of his own little pilgrims. And the Shining One has set the king's mark on my forehead, and I have a roll that I am to show at the end of my journey. You have not got any of these things because you did not come in at the wicket gate." But the boys only laughed, so little Christian left them and walked on by himself. And here's our picture of boys climbing over the wall, and that's called the Wall of Salvation. Presently they all came to the foot of the hill called Difficulty. The way of the king led over the hill. It was very rough and very steep, but little Christian knew that he must not turn away from it. A spring of cool water was flowing just by the wayside, so, as he was very thirsty, he took a refreshing drink and then began to climb the rocky path. I think I'll have a refreshing drink right now. Formalist and Hypocrisy were a little way behind Christian, and when they came up to the hill, they saw two paths, which turned one to the right and the other to the left of the straight road. "What is the good of climbing up that steep place?" they said. "These two paths are smooth and easy, and as they go round the hill, they must come into the king's way again on the other side." So Formalist said, "I will go along on this path," and Hypocrisy said, "I will go along on that one." And the boys parted, believing that they would meet again very soon. Now, if they had entered by the wicket gate, they would have known, as little Christian did, that the straight road was the only safe one. But I am sorry to tell you that both these foolish boys were lost, because they had not taken the trouble to obey the king and begin their pilgrimage in the right way. Formalist had entered the path of danger, and very soon he found himself in a great wood. He wandered about for many nights and days, but he could not find his way out of it, and so at last he died of hunger and cold. The path of destruction, which Hypocrisy had chosen, was no better. It led into the midst of some dark mountains, where the boy went up and down until his foot slipped, and he fell, wounding himself upon the sharp rocks, so that he died a painful death. And here's a picture of our path again. We always have to be reminded that the main path, you must stay on it. Don't go on the little paths off the side. Little Christian found the path up the hillside a very hard one. It was covered with rough stones and sharp pieces of rock, which hurt his feet, even through his shoes, and it became steeper and steeper as he went on, until at last he was obliged to creep along on his hands and knees. The sun was now shining very brightly, for it was the middle of the day, and its rays fell upon little Christian and made him feel hot and tired. "What should I have done," he thought, "if I had had to climb this hill yesterday? I could never have carried my burden up such a dreadful road." Remember, he lost his burden at the cross. When he was about halfway up the hill, the path became easier. He was able to walk again, and the stones did not seem to be quite so sharp. Still, it was hard work climbing, and when he came presently to a little shady arbor, he was very glad indeed. This arbor had been built by order of the king, so that his pilgrims might have a place in which to rest on their way over the hill. Little Christian went in and sat down. It was cool and quiet, and he thought that he would now have time to look at the roll that the Shining One had given to him. So he took it out and read in it for a little while. Then, instead of making haste to the top of the hill, he sat a little idly and lazily in the arbor, looking at his new clothes and thinking of many things, until his eyes closed and he fell asleep. He did not wake until late in the afternoon, and we looked at the sky and saw that it was already beginning to grow crimson with the sunset. He started up and began to walk as quickly as he could. Before he reached the top of the hill, he met two boys running very fast indeed. Their faces were white with fear, and their whole bodies were trembling, but when they saw little Christian, they stopped to speak to him. "What is the matter?" he asked. "You're running the wrong way." "Oh," cried the eldest, whose name was Timorous, We were going to the city of the king, and we had climbed up this terrible hill. But the farther we go, the more danger we find. So we are hurrying home again." "Yes," said the other, who was called Mistrust. "There are two great lions lying just in the way, and we don't know whether they're asleep or not. But I'm sure that if we try to pass them, we'll be torn to pieces." Then little Christian began to feel frightened too, and he said, What shall I do?" "Why, come back with us," said Timorous. "You cannot be so foolish as to venture near those savage beasts." "I don't know," replied little Christian. "If I go back, I shall never see the king." "Well, you will not see him if you go on," said Mistrust, "for the lions will kill you." But little Christian remembered that Evangelist and Goodwill and the kind interpreter had all told him that, although he might often be frightened and in trouble, the king would surely help him and take care of him. "I don't think I will turn back," he said. "The lions might... I don't think I will turn back," he said. "The lions may not be awake. Let us all go together." "Oh, no," cried Timorous and Mistrust. "We dare not. We shall just make the best of our way home again and be very thankful when we get there safely." So they ran down the hill and left little Christian to go on his way alone. He could not help being frightened, and he thought, "I will look at my roll and see whether there is anything written in it about these lions." But when he put his hand into the breast of his jacket, the roll was not there, and though he felt carefully among his clothes, he could not find it anywhere. "Where can it be?" he said, and he stood still to think how he could have possibly lost it. He was in very great trouble, for he remembered that the Shining One had told him to take care of the roll, for he would be asked to show it at the gate of the celestial city. "I cannot go without it," he cried. "Oh, what shall I do?" And the tears began to roll down his cheeks. The loss of his roll made poor little Christian very miserable. He forgot all about the lions in his trouble and could think only of his carelessness in losing the most precious of the king's gifts. Suddenly, he remembered the shady arbor in which he had spent the afternoon. Perhaps the roll might have fallen there, and when he started up so hurriedly, he might not have seen it. "Oh, how could I be so foolish?" he cried. "I ought only to have rested there, and I wasted so much time, and now it'll be night before I reach the top of the hill." He turned around and went back slowly, looking carefully at the path, lest he might have dropped the roll on his way. At last he reached the arbor, and there, up on the floor, just under the bench upon which he'd been sitting, he saw his lost treasure. We can imagine how eagerly he caught it up and how thankful he felt to the king for letting him find it again. But his search for the roll had hindered the little pilgrim, and although he climbed the steep path once more as quickly as he could, the sun had gone out of sight before he reached the top of the hill, and the light was fading very fast. "It is all my own fault," he thought. "If I had not been so idle and lazy, I should not have lost my roll, and I might have had time to find a place to rest in before the night." Then he remembered the lions, and he wondered how far he was from the spot where they lay. He knew that those savage beasts always prowl about in search of their prey during the darkness, and as the shadows grew deeper and deeper around him, he felt more and more afraid. Just when the light had become very dim indeed, a large building appeared in the distance, and as Christian hurried along, he saw that it was a great palace, and that the way of the king would lead him close to its gates. A little cottage stood within the gates, which he supposed must be the doorkeeper's lodge, and he walked quickly toward it, hoping that he might be allowed to stay there for the night. The path now became very narrow indeed, and when he had almost reached the palace gates, Christian saw the two lions, which had so frightened Mistrust and Timorous, laying just before him, one on each side of the way. The lions were chained, but it was too dark for the chains to be seen, and little Christian stood still, wondering what he should do. There was only a very small space between the lions, and he thought if he ventured to pass them, they would surely spring up on him. And here's a picture of our lions. I would be afraid of that. I could be a little timorous there, a little timid. But Christian, I bet he goes through. Let's see. Well, the name of the doorkeeper was Watchful, and he knew how much the pilgrims feared the lions. So he came very often to the door of his house to see if anyone was coming near. When he saw little Christian, he called to him saying, "Don't be frightened. The lions are both chained. Keep in the middle of the path, and they will not hurt you." So Christian went on, trembling and very much afraid, but he was so careful to keep in the middle of the path, and although the great creatures roared as he walked between them, they lay still and did not even stretch out their huge paws to touch him. When he had passed the lions, little Christian clapped his hands for joy and ran quickly towards the kind gatekeeper who stood there. "What palace is this?" he asked. "It's called the Palace Beautiful," said Watchful, "and it belongs to the king. He built it for his pilgrims to use. Are you going to the celestial city?" "Yes," answered little Christian. "I slept last night at the house of the interpreter. Do you think I may stay here until the morning?" "How is it that you are traveling so late?" asked the porter. Well, then little Christian had to tell of his laziness in the afternoon and how he had lost his roll and had been obliged to go back to look for it. "Well," said Watchful, "I will call the lady of the house, and if you are one of the king's little pilgrims, she will take care of you." So they went together to the door of the palace, and the doorkeeper rang the bell. Well, that's all of our reading for today, but thinking about those two lions made me think and remember that I'm sitting right between two dragons. Do you remember that when we talked about the story chair? Two dragons. We said then, you never be afraid of danger or fear. You just keep a-going. So that's what little Pilgrim did today. So I hope you enjoyed that. Remember, wash your hands, brush your teeth, and eat an ice chip. Today I'm eating licorice, and it's not red.